The Arizona Territory stretched endlessly under the merciless sun of 1882, its red earth cracked like the promises made by men in distant Washington offices. Samuel Harrison wiped the sweat from his weathered brow as he guided his horse through the narrow canyon that led to Fort Apache. The leather reins felt slick in his calloused hands, worn smooth by 23 years of frontier life. Behind him, a small wagon creaked under the weight of supplies, destined for the military outpost. But Samuel's mind wandered far from his cargo. 3 months had passed since the massacre at Cibecue Creek, where Apache medicine man Nokai Del Clina had been killed by soldiers, sparking a violent uprising that left dozens dead on both sides. The aftermath still hung heavy in the desert air, like the smell of gunpowder and spilled blood. Samuel had witnessed enough bloodshed in his years as a government contractor to know that violence only bred more violence, yet he continued his monthly supply runs to the fort, driven by necessity rather than patriotism. The canyon walls rose majestically around him, their ancient stone faces carved by millennia of wind and rain into shapes that seemed to watch his passage with silent judgment. Somewhere in these labyrinthine passages lived the remnants of the Apache bands who had refused to surrender to reservation life, choosing instead the harsh freedom of their ancestral lands. Samuel respected their choice, even as he feared the consequences of their defiance. As the fort's wooden palisades came into view, Samuel noticed an unusual commotion near the main gate. Soldiers moved with urgent purpose, their blue uniforms dark with perspiration in the afternoon heat. Captain William Morrison, the fort's commanding officer, stood in animated conversation with a group of his subordinates, his normally composed demeanor replaced by visible agitation. Samuel had known Morrison for 5 years, long enough to recognize when the captain was genuinely troubled. Samuel guided his wagon through the fort's entrance, nodding to the sentries who had grown accustomed to his regular visits. The interior of Fort Apache bustled with activity that seemed different from the usual military routine. Soldiers hurried between buildings with an urgency that suggested something significant had occurred. Near the quartermaster's office, Samuel noticed a small crowd gathered around what appeared to be a heated discussion between officers and civilian scouts. "Harrison!" Captain Morrison's voice cut through the desert air as he strode toward the wagon. His face, normally weathered by sun and responsibility into a mask of stoic professionalism, now showed lines of genuine concern. "I'm glad you're here. We need to talk." Samuel climbed down from his wagon seat, his boots raising small clouds of dust as they hit the hard-packed earth. At 45, his body bore the accumulated wear of frontier life, shoulders permanently bent from years of heavy lifting, hands scarred by rope and weather, and eyes that had learned to read danger in the subtle movements of both man and nature. "What's the trouble, Captain? You look like you've seen a ghost." Morrison glanced around nervously before speaking, ensuring their conversation wouldn't be overheard by the enlisted men. "We captured someone yesterday. An Apache woman, barely more than a girl, really. She was found half dead from thirst about 10 miles north of here, wandering alone in the desert." The captain paused, his jaw working silently, as if struggling with his next words. "The problem is, we can't figure out who she is or where she came from." Samuel removed his hat and ran his fingers through his graying hair. In his years of dealing with the military and various Apache bands, he had learned that such mysteries usually came with dangerous complications. "What makes you think she's Apache? Could be Navajo, or even Mexican." "She's Apache, all right," Morrison replied firmly. Corporal Jenkins, who spent years tracking these people, confirmed it by her clothing and the way she carries herself. But here's the strange part. She won't speak. Not a word in Apache, English or Spanish. She just stares at us with these dark eyes that seem to look right through you. The two men walked toward the fort's center, passing the blacksmith shop, where the rhythmic hammering of metal on metal provided a stark counterpoint to their conversation. Samuel noticed how the soldiers they passed seemed unusually tense, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon as if expecting trouble. The woman's presence had clearly unsettled the entire garrison. "Where are you keeping her?" Samuel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Military protocol for Apache prisoners, especially women, followed predictable patterns that rarely showed much consideration for basic human dignity. Morrison's expression grew uncomfortable. "We had to put her in the storage shed behind the commissary. It's the only secure place we have that's appropriate for a woman." The captain's hesitation revealed his own discomfort with the arrangement. "We've given her food and water, of course, but she won't touch any of it. I'm starting to worry she might be trying to starve herself." The storage shed Morrison referred to was little more than a wooden box, perhaps 8 feet square, with a single small window high on one wall. Samuel had seen it used occasionally to store overflow supplies, but never as a prison for human beings. The thought of a young woman locked inside that stifling space in the Arizona heat made his stomach turn. "Has anyone tried to communicate with her using sign language?" Samuel asked. Many Apache bands used a complex system of hand signals that could bridge language barriers, especially when dealing with other tribes or white settlers. "Corporal Martinez tried," Morrison replied. "He's got some experience with Apache signs from his time with General Crook, but she just sits there, doesn't respond to anything. It's like she's not really there, if you understand what I mean." They reached the commissary building, a long wooden structure that served as the fort's primary food storage facility. Behind it, the storage shed squatted like a brown toad in the dust, its single door secured with a heavy iron padlock. 2 soldiers stood guard nearby, their rifles held casually but ready. The sight of armed men watching over what was essentially a wooden cage made Samuel's jaw tighten with suppressed anger. "Captain, with all due respect, keeping a woman locked in that shed is going to cause you more problems than you can imagine," Samuel said quietly. "If word gets out that the army is treating Apache women like animals, it'll give the war chiefs all the ammunition they need to justify another uprising." Morrison's face flushed red beneath his tan. "What would you have me do, Harrison? Turn her loose so she can run back to her people and tell them everything she's seen here? We're sitting on a powder keg as it is. Half the Apache bands in the territory are still angry about what happened at Cybercue Creek." Samuel understood the captain's dilemma, but years of living on the frontier had taught him that treating people with dignity, regardless of their race or circumstances, was not only morally right but practically necessary for survival. The Apache people had long memories and strong concepts of honor and justice. Mistreating one of their women would be seen as an unforgivable insult that could trigger violence far beyond anything the isolated fort could handle. "Let me talk to her," Samuel said after a moment of consideration. "I've had dealings with Apache bands from all over the territory. Maybe I can figure out where she's from, or at least get her to eat something." Morrison looked skeptical. "What makes you think you can succeed where my men have failed?" "Because I'm not wearing a blue uniform," Samuel replied simply, "and because I'm not pointing a rifle at her." The captain considered this for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the shed where their mysterious prisoner remained silent. Finally he nodded. "All right, Harrison, you can try, but I want you to understand. If she escapes, I'll hold you personally responsible. We can't afford to let word of her presence here reach the wrong people." Samuel nodded his agreement, though privately he wondered what wrong people Morrison was referring to. In his experience, keeping secrets on the frontier was nearly impossible. News traveled through the desert with the persistence of tumbleweeds carried by traders, scouts, and the mysterious communication networks that seemed to exist among all the territory's various populations. The guard stepped aside as Morrison produced a large iron key from his belt. The padlock opened with a harsh, metallic click that seemed unnaturally loud in the afternoon stillness. Morrison pulled the heavy wooden door open, revealing the shed's dim interior. The smell hit Samuel first, a mixture of fear, human waste, and the stifling heat that had been building inside the wooden box all day. As his eyes adjusted to the darkness, He could make out a small figure huddled in the far corner, knees drawn up to her chest, long black hair hanging like a curtain around her face. "Miss," Samuel called softly in English, making no move to enter the shed. "My name is Samuel Harrison. I'm not a soldier. I'm here to help." The figure didn't move or acknowledge his presence in any way. Samuel tried again in the few Apache words he knew, his pronunciation careful but certainly imperfect. Still no response. Stepping carefully into the shed, Samuel kept his movements slow and non-threatening. The heat inside was overwhelming, at least 20 degrees hotter than the already scorching temperature outside. Sweat immediately began to bead on his forehead as he knelt down several feet away from the woman, close enough to see her clearly, but far enough to avoid seeming aggressive. She was indeed young, probably no more than 18 or 20 years old. Her Apache dress, though dusty and torn, showed the intricate beadwork and careful construction that indicated she came from a family of some status within her band. Her hair was traditionally braided with small ornaments that caught what little light filtered through the shed's single window, but it was her eyes that struck Samuel most forcefully, dark and intelligent, but filled with a profound sadness that seemed to go far beyond her current predicament. "You're safe here," Samuel said gently, switching back to English. "No one's going to hurt you." For the first time, the woman's eyes focused directly on his face. Samuel felt a chill run down his spine as he realized she understood English perfectly well. The intelligence in her gaze was unmistakable, as was the careful evaluation she was making of this new person who had entered her prison. "The soldiers want to know where you're from," Samuel continued, keeping his voice low and calm. "They're afraid you might be from one of the bands that's been raiding settlements, but I think you're running from something, not toward it." A slight tightening around the woman's eyes suggested Samuel's guess had hit close to the mark. She remained silent, but her posture shifted almost imperceptibly, becoming slightly more alert and focused. Samuel reached slowly into his shirt pocket and withdrew a piece of hardtack and a small flask of water. "You need to eat something. I know the situation seems hopeless, but starving yourself won't solve anything." He placed the food and water on the shed's wooden floor, midway between himself and the woman, then slowly backed toward the door. "I'll leave these here. Think about what I've said." Outside the shed, Captain Morrison waited with barely concealed impatience. "Well, did you learn anything?" "She understands English," Samuel reported, "and she's educated. The way she looked at me, evaluated me. This isn't some wild Apache who's never seen white people before." Morrison frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means she's been around whites enough to know how to read us," Samuel explained, "which suggests she might be from one of the reservation bands, or possibly from a mixed community. But if that's the case, why was she wandering alone in the desert?" The captain's frown deepened. "You think she escaped from the reservation?" "I think she's running from something," Samuel said. "The question is what, and whether we're helping her or making things worse by keeping her locked up." That evening, Samuel made camp in his usual spot just outside the fort's walls. He had been making supply runs to Fort Apache for 5 years, and the routine of setting up his simple camp had become second nature. As darkness fell across the desert, he built a small fire and prepared a simple meal of beans and bacon, but his thoughts remained fixed on the young Apache woman locked in the storage shed. The desert night brought its customary symphony of sounds, the distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of small creatures moving through the scrub brush, and the soft whisper of wind through the canyon walls. Samuel had long ago learned to find comfort in these sounds, but tonight they seemed charged with an underlying tension that made sleep elusive. Around midnight, he was startled by the soft sound of footsteps approaching his camp. His hand instinctively moved toward the rifle that lay beside his bedroll, but he relaxed when he recognized the silhouette of Corporal Martinez, one of the fort's most experienced scouts. "Evening, Mr. Harrison," Martinez said quietly, settling down beside the dying fire. "Mind if I join you for a few minutes?" Samuel gestured toward a spot near the fire. Martinez was a good man, one of the few soldiers at Fort Apache who seemed to understand that the Apache people were more than just another enemy to be defeated. His mixed Mexican and Apache heritage gave him insights that most of his fellow soldiers lacked. "I heard you talk to the woman today," Martinez said without preamble. "Captain Morrison thinks you might have made some progress." "Not much," Samuel admitted. "She understood me, but she's not ready to talk. There's something she's afraid of, something that makes being locked in that shed seem like the safer option." Martinez nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about where she might have come from. Her clothing, the way she carries herself. I think she might be Chiricahua Apache." Samuel knew enough about Apache tribal distinctions to understand the significance of Martinez's observation. The Chiricahua had been some of the most resistant to reservation life, and their leader, Geronimo, had become legendary for his ability to evade capture by American and Mexican forces. If the woman was Chiricahua, it would explain both her obvious intelligence and her reluctance to trust white soldiers. If she's Chiricahua, then she's probably seen more violence and betrayal than most people experience in a lifetime, Samuel mused. No wonder she won't talk. "There's something else," Martinez said, lowering his voice even further. "I heard from some of the Mescalero scouts that there was trouble at one of the smaller camps about 2 weeks ago. Sounds like there was some kind of internal dispute, maybe over whether to surrender to the reservation." Oh, the implications of this information hit Samuel immediately. If the woman had fled from internal tribal conflict, it would explain her solitary condition and her reluctance to identify herself. Among Apache bands, family disputes and political disagreements could sometimes lead to exile or worse. "Did your scouts say anything about survivors from this dispute?" Samuel asked. Martinez shook his head. "Nothing specific. You know how these stories get passed around. By the time they reach us, half the details are wrong, and the other half are missing entirely." The two men sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, each lost in his own thoughts. Finally, Martinez stood to leave. "Mr. Harrison, I hope you'll keep trying to reach her. Captain Morrison is getting pressure from his superiors to resolve this situation quickly, and I don't think his patience is going to last much longer." After Martinez left, Samuel lay awake staring at the stars that blazed with startling clarity in the desert sky. Somewhere in the fort behind him, a young woman sat alone in a stifling wooden box, carrying secrets that might be the key to preventing another outbreak of violence in the territory. The weight of that responsibility settled heavily on his shoulders. The next morning brought news that changed everything. Samuel was awakened before dawn by the sound of horses approaching his camp at a gallop. Captain Morrison and 3 of his soldiers rode up in a cloud of dust, their faces grim with urgent purpose. "Harrison, we need to talk," Morrison said without dismounting. "We just received word from Fort Thomas that a band of Chiricahua Apache attacked a mining camp near Globe yesterday. 3 men are dead, and the survivors say they're heading this way." Samuel felt his blood turn cold. If hostile Apache forces were indeed moving toward Fort Apache, the presence of the mysterious woman in the storage shed suddenly became far more complicated. "How reliable is this information?" "Reliable enough that I'm sending out patrols immediately," Morrison replied. "But here's the problem. If that woman is connected to this band, if she's some kind of advanced scout or messenger, then keeping her here could be a disaster. On the other hand, if she's running from them, she might be our only source of information about their plans and numbers." The captain's dilemma was clear, and Samuel understood the terrible mathematics of frontier warfare. In conflicts between Apache bands and American forces, small mistakes in judgment often led to large numbers of casualties. The fort's garrison numbered fewer than 60 men, hardly enough to withstand a determined assault by experienced Apache warriors. "Captain, I need to spend more time with her," Samuel said urgently. "Give me one more day. If I can get her to trust me, she might tell us what we need to know." Morrison looked skeptical, but the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. A lone rider was approaching from the south, his horse lathered with sweat and showing signs of having been ridden hard for many miles. As the rider drew closer, Samuel recognized him as Jake Peterson, a civilian scout who worked for various military posts throughout the territory. Peterson's horse stumbled to a halt beside the group, and the rider himself looked exhausted and shaken. "Captain Morrison, thank God you're here," he gasped. "I've been riding all night with news from Tucson." Morrison's expression became even more serious. "What kind of news, Peterson?" "It's about that Apache woman you've got locked up," Peterson said, his words coming in short, breathless bursts. "Her name is Ayanna. She's the daughter of Cocheta, one of the most respected war chiefs in the Chiricahua Band." The implications of this revelation hit everyone present like a physical blow. Cocheta's reputation as a warrior and leader was legendary throughout the Southwest. If his daughter was being held prisoner at Fort Apache, it would be seen as an act of war by the entire Chiricahua nation. "How do you know this?" Morrison demanded. Peterson wiped sweat from his face with a grimy sleeve. "Because there's a price on her head, Captain. Not from us, from her own people. According to what I heard in Tucson, she opposed some kind of planned attack on American settlements. When the War Council voted to proceed anyway, she tried to warn the targets. Her own father declared her a traitor and ordered her capture." Samuel felt pieces of a complex puzzle beginning to fall into place. If Peterson's information was accurate, then Ayanna had not only risked her life to prevent violence against white settlers, but had also sacrificed her position within her own tribe to do so. Her silence and apparent despair suddenly made perfect sense. "There's more," Peterson continued. "Cocheta's warriors are actively hunting for her. If they find out she's here, they'll attack the fort to get her back, not to rescue her, but to execute her for betraying the tribe." Captain Morrison's face had gone pale beneath his desert tan. The situation he faced was now far more complex and dangerous than a simple matter of dealing with an Apache prisoner. He was holding a woman whose very existence threatened to trigger a war, regardless of what action he took. "How much time do we have?" Morrison asked. "Hard to say," Peterson replied, "but I saw signs of unshod horses moving north from the Dragoon Mountains. Could be Cocheta's men, could be someone else. Either way, they're heading in this direction." Samuel's mind raced through the available options, none of which seemed particularly promising. If they released Ayanna, she would likely be captured and killed by her own people within days. If they kept her at the fort, they risked a siege by some of the most skilled warriors in North America. If they turned her over to Cocheta, they would be condemning an innocent woman to death for the crime of trying to prevent violence. "Captain," Samuel said slowly, "I think our only option is to get her away from here entirely. If we can move her to safety somewhere beyond Cocheta's reach, it might buy us the time we need to find a permanent solution." Morrison looked skeptical. "And where exactly would you suggest we take her? Every Apache band in the territory knows about the conflict within the Chiricahua. She'd be recognized and probably killed anywhere we might go." Samuel had been thinking about this problem, and a possible solution had begun to take shape in his mind. "There's a mission station about 40 miles east of here, run by a Presbyterian minister named Thomas Walker. He's been working with Apache families for years, helping them adapt to reservation life. If anyone could provide sanctuary for Ayanna, it would be him." "You're talking about removing a prisoner from military custody," Morrison said. "I could be court-martialed for that. And if you keep her here, you could be dead," Samuel replied bluntly, "along with every man in this fort." The captain stared toward the fort's wooden walls, clearly weighing his limited options. Finally, he turned back to Samuel with a look of grim determination. "All right, Harrison. You've got until sunset to convince her to go with you voluntarily. If she won't cooperate, I'll have to make other arrangements." Samuel understood the unspoken implications of Morrison's words. Military other arrangements for inconvenient Apache prisoners rarely ended well for the prisoners involved. As the group rode back toward the fort, Samuel's thoughts focused on the enormous challenge ahead of him. He had less than 8 hours to gain the trust of a young woman who had every reason to distrust white men, convince her to leave the relative safety of military custody, and persuade her to accompany him on a dangerous journey through territory controlled by people who wanted her dead. The morning sun climbed higher in the cloudless Arizona sky as Samuel prepared for what might be the most important conversation of his life. In the storage shed behind the commissary, Ayanna waited in her stifling prison, unaware that her fate and the fate of everyone at Fort Apache now hung in the balance. The sound of the padlock opening seemed unusually loud in the desert stillness, and Samuel paused for a moment before pulling the heavy door open. Whatever happened in the next few hours would determine not only Ayanna's future, but possibly the future of the entire Arizona Territory. The weight of that responsibility settled on his shoulders like a physical burden as he stepped into the dim interior of the shed. "Ayanna," he said softly, using her name for the first time, "we need to talk."